On the opening slide in this particular section, it's called Changes in Intimacy. And really, um, we're going to be transitioning from friends or just friends into romantic partners in just a second. But part of that is going to come down to changes in intimacy. As a whole, when we talk about relationships, and I use that term broadly here, and how they change over adolescence, we know that we tend to see adolescents reporting that relationships are closer. These are going to be more of these, again, these horizontal relationships. So those with peers, friends, and romantic partners. More personal, so sharing more aspects about yourself and hearing those from other people. And then definitely more emotionally charged. When we talk about the word intimacy, there's a lot of confusion sometimes on how that word is used. In mainstream language, intimacy often means like sexual behaviors, or if we have an intimate conversation. But when we operationally define it in the psychological literature, it really is about caring for another person, sharing intimate or sharing close information, or I'm trying not to use the word intimate, sharing personal information with another person. It's an emotional attachment. You really are concerned for that other person and they're concerned for you. You're willing to disclose these topics that are taboo or sensitive. And also, it's a person. If you're sharing intimate or even intimate relationship with a person, then you're often sharing common interests and activities. So you can see that you can definitely be intimate without being sexual, in the sense that with intimacy, you're just sharing a part of yourself and an emotional part of yourself, and the person is sharing that with you. And similarly, you could be sexual without being intimate. So it can go in both directions, but these aren't the same thing. They're definitely separate constructs. We already talked about how the peer group changes broadly, but the nature of friendships also change. Um, when we think about behaviors that are related to friendship in childhood, we do know that children are more likely to share with a friend versus just a random person or a peer. They're more likely to help a friend versus, again, random person or peer. But in adolescence, we also see changes in self-disclosure, loyalty, this greater display of engaging in similar interests, more likely to share attitudes and share those attitudes with your friend and share values. In general, we just see more intimacy in adolescence. Part of this is because this is an abstract concept, and so children have a hard time with this. Part of it also takes place in the brain, where we can be more connected with our emotions, like we already talked about in the cognitive development presentation. We also see in adolescence that arguments tend to be more emotional, and you can probably remember back to, let's say, early high school days, where it just seemed like there was more anger or hurt feelings, or more easily hurt feelings, more likely to know which buttons you can press because you do have more disclosure on the part of a friend. So if you know what hurts them, not necessarily saying this is a good thing to do, but it's easier to use that against them. But nevertheless, we also see in adolescence more of an aim to restore those friendships. So because we have a lot more invested in friendships, that when we do have fights or arguments, that we are trying to fix those and restore that more so than in other parts of life, or at least earlier in childhood. Not to say that we don't have friend breakups; those happen too. And but when we're talking about more these common fights or feuds, that eventually we are more likely to tackle those in adolescence. There are some differences depending on age. So older adolescents are more likely to have conflicts and fights with their friends over more private matters, whereas younger adolescents are really concerned with their image or their self-image and how other people are seeing them. So more likely to get into fights with their friends if they think that they were publicly disrespected in some way, or their friend didn't have their back in a moment, let's say in the school cafeteria. And part of this, again, comes down to peer pressure, this imaginary audience that lessens as we get through adolescence. Again, doesn't go away. We still know adults who have an imaginary audience, but this is one of those developmental findings that we see with younger adolescents being more upset about these public disrespect issues, where older adolescents are less likely to have those things faze them, but there are other things that are more private that do bother them. Let's get into some fun stuff. I really like talking about dating in adolescence. I think it's something that is uh, just fun to talk about and interesting, and we can all think back to our experiences in middle school or junior high where people started to date. Even if it wasn't you, it's still fun to reminisce back about those experiences. If it was you, also fun to reminisce, or it can be. So first, let's talk about dating historically. Dating wasn't always for fun. I mean, in some cultures, this is still the case today. But in times past, it was more like you're only going to date somebody if it's like they're courting you and you're getting ready for marriage. This is somebody that you're selecting for life. And that's it's different now. If we were in class, I'd ask the group to try to define this word dating. If somebody says, I'm dating so and so, what does that actually mean? And if again, if I were to ask you as a class, you'd have different definitions. For some of you, that's going to mean that, on occasion you meet somebody, let's say via Tinder, or maybe it's on campus, and you actually physically go out for a date, but it's not exclusive. For others of you, this is like social media official, Facebook official, that if you are dating somebody, this means that you're a couple. So the word dating has to be operationally defined. Sure, it could mean group activities. And when we're talking about younger adolescents, let's say 12-year-olds, oftentimes we see a whole group of adolescents that are going out together, but there are people within that group that are seemingly dating, although an outsider may not even know it. We could talk about casual dating, as I already mentioned, serious boyfriend or girlfriend. The one thing I want to point out here is that if you are doing a research study and you are interested in dating behaviors, you have to be very, very specific on how you're defining that word. If you want it to mean, are you in a serious romantic relationship, you have to spell that out and say that. If you are you, interested in somebody who's casually dating and what that means in terms of, let's say, going on multiple dates with multiple people in a certain span of time, you have to say that. This is something that's really important because everybody does have their own definitions. In terms of the rates for adolescents and engaging in dating behavior, and note that, again, dating behavior could mean a lot of different things. This is just one study, so I do not need you to know those specific percentages, but I do want you to know the overall pattern. So in this particular sample, there were 25% of 12-year-olds that they engaged in dating, 50% of 15-year-olds, and 66% of 18-year-olds said that they had a relationship in the last 18 months. What counts as a relationship? That's a great question. It has to be defined by the research team. You think about a 12-year-old's relationship compared to an 18-year-old relationship, you would expect that those would look different. Again, so the point here is not that you need to know 25, 50, and 66%, but more that as we get older, there's more individuals who report that they've been in some kind of relationship in the last 18 months. The average age in which somebody starts dating, and again, I'm using finger quotes, you can't see me, but dating in the US is around 13 or 14. Usually those relationships are short-lived, but nevertheless, that's when they're existing. And by the mid-high school, so 16 years old, let's say, average relationships actually lasting quite a long time in the dating world, 6 months. And you better believe that you celebrate each of those months, right? You get some kind of card or celebration after month 1, after month 2, after month 3. I hope you're chuckling in your head at least, if not out loud, because you can remember these moments. Again, if this happened to you or it happened to somebody else, just remembering how those things were celebrated. Dating in adolescence is fun. There are some pretty cool gender differences by and large. So obviously there are individual differences between both boys and girls, but some interesting gender differences when it comes to dating and the development of intimacy. So when we think about adolescence broadly, romantic relationships are the context that we typically see intimacy expressed rather than learned. This means that, and based on research, which has looked at predictors of intimacy, the quality of your friendships actually predicts the quality of your romantic relationships. This means that you're learning skills in friendships that help you use those skills in romantic relationships. You're learning how to disclose, how to listen, how to perspective take within friendships, and how you perform in those friendships predicts how well that you can use those skills in a romantic relationship. It doesn't go in the other direction. This means that if you are, you know, there's no evidence that if you are learning these skills in a romantic relationships, it affects your friendships. That said, this is where the gender difference emerges. That for females who, from the beginning of this lecture, we talked about were more likely to be spending time with peers, and the research also shows that they're more likely to be intimate with their friends and share aspects of their life and be more emotional. As a whole, you may be a female who that's not for you, and you may know many males who are really intimate and share aspects about themselves, but as a whole. And so when we're talking about it here in the context of romantic relationships, the boys on average may not have as many of those skills built up from their friendships. And so when they enter into romantic relationships, and usually this is in the context of heterosexual relationships, not that this doesn't happen in gay relationships either, but it's just the sense that we've done more research on straight relationships. But boys may need further development. So they actually are learning more about intimacy within the context of a romantic relationship. The age in which you start dating is really affected by the expectations and norms of your community. So if you are in a culture, subculture where dating is really common or dating is really encouraged, then these expectations are going to be shared with you and or expected of you. If you're in a culture or subculture where these things are more taboo or discouraged, less likely to start dating. Another finding that influences the timing of dating is that people who go through puberty earlier tend to date earlier. This applies for both males and females, but it depends on the context still. Again, is it expected? Is it the norm? Is it taboo? And we're going to talk more about that on the next slide.